Imagine a world where the line between life and death blurs. It's the early 1800s, and a scientist steps into a crowded theater, not with a scalpel. Today, we're diving into the electrifying tale of Aldini's quest to reanimate the dead. This isn't the electricity of your phone charger. This is raw, untamed, sparking in crude batteries and Leyden jars, promising to unlock the secrets of life itself. It's called galvanism, named after Luigi Galvani, an Italian physician who discovered that frog legs twitched when struck by an electric current. Doctors dissected corpses in public, hoping to map the human body. Philosophers debated the soul, while priests warned against tampering with God's domain. Yet the Enlightenment had sparked a hunger for knowledge, a belief that science could conquer even the grave. Aldini saw galvanism as the key. If electricity was the spark of life, could it jolt a dead body back to consciousness? He'd attach metallic rods to nerves, muscles, and even the spinal cord, then crank up the voltage. The results? Corpses that seemed to come alive. Arms would jerk, chests would heave, and in one case, an eye reportedly opened, staring blankly at the crowd. To onlookers, it was as if the soul had been yanked back from the abyss. But was it life or just a cruel imitation? It was a question that would define his career and haunt his legacy. Was the soul mechanical, or was electricity merely puppeteering lifeless flesh? These questions weren't just scientific, they were philosophical, even theological. The church watched nervously, warning of hubris, yet Aldini pressed on, convinced he was on the verge of a breakthrough. Little did he know, his most infamous experiment was yet to come. One that would shock the world and inspire a literary monster. Galvani believed this was proof of an animal electricity, a vital spark that animated all living things. The results were astonishing. A dead frog's leg would kick as if ready to hop away. An ox's head, severed from its body, would shudder, its eyes rolling, its tongue lolling out. Audiences were equal parts horrified and mesmerized. To them, this wasn't just science, it was a glimpse into the forbidden. Aldini, with his flair for drama, leaned into the spectacle. He'd perform in darkened rooms, letting the sparks light up his face as he declared electricity the fire of life. His nephew, Giovanni Aldini, would take this idea and push it to places no one dared imagine. This wasn't some back-alley grave-robbing scheme. Aldini worked with legal bodies, often those of executed criminals, provided by governments eager to advance science. Others point to the era's obsession with conquering death. Smallpox killed millions, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. If Aldini could crack the code of resurrection, he'd be a hero. But there was something else, something darker. Aldini's writings hint at a fascination with the boundary between life and death, a need to probe the unknown, even if it meant defying nature itself. In Bologna, Paris, and later London, he'd set up his equipment in anatomical theaters, where students, doctors, and curious onlookers packed the seats. The stage was set for one of the most bizarre chapters in scientific history. Picture this: a hanged criminal's body, still warm, convulsing under electric shocks as a crowd gasps in horror. He was a showman, a professor, and a man obsessed with one question. Could electricity not just mimic life, but restore it? By the 1800s, he was a rising star in European science, lecturing in grand theaters and dazzling audiences with demonstrations that blurred the line between miracle and madness. But to understand Aldini, we need to step into his world, a time when death was everywhere. Disease, war, and public executions filled the streets with bodies, and scientists were racing to unravel the mysteries of life and death. Was this science a spectacle, or something darker? We'll explore the man, his methods, and the world that both feared and cheered his work. So, grab a seat, dim the lights, and let's step into the shadowy laboratories of the 19th century. You won't believe what happens when the dead start dancing. But with a battery powerful enough to make the dead twitch, blink, and gasp. This is no fiction. This is the story of Giovanni Aldini, the man who shocked the world, literally, by trying to bring corpses back to life. His experiments were so wild, so grotesque, they inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But was he a genius on the cusp of conquering death? Or a madman playing God in a lightning-lit lab? Welcome to Real History, where we uncover the strange, the mysterious, and the downright chilling truths of the past. The year is 1791, and the scientific world is buzzing with a new, almost magical force: electricity. Born in Bologna in 1762, Aldini was no ordinary scientist. In the 1800s, death wasn't just an end, it was a frontier. Aldini's early experiments were with animals. He'd take dead frogs, dogs, even oxen, and hook them to his voltaic piles, early batteries invented by Alessandro Volta. But animals were just the beginning. By 1803, Aldini was ready to take his experiments to the ultimate test: human corpses. Why was Aldini so driven? Some say it was ambition, a desire to outshine his uncle and cement his name in history. His methods were meticulous, but chilling. He'd use freshly executed bodies, still warm, blood barely settled, to maximize the chance of success. Aldini's experiments raised profound questions. What was life if a dead body could move? The London spectacle and the birth of a monster. In January 1803, Giovanni Aldini arrived in London, a city gripped by both progress and fear. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping the world, but public executions at Newgate Prison drew crowds as eager for blood as for justice. Hours after the hanging, the body was rushed to a nearby anatomical theater, courtesy of the British government, which saw Aldini's work as a chance to advance medical knowledge. The room was packed: surgeons, scientists, and thrill-seekers crammed shoulder to shoulder, their breath visible in the cold air. Aldini, ever the showman, knew this was his moment. Newspapers splashed the story across London, calling Aldini a modern Prometheus, a nod to the mythical figure who stole fire from the gods. The public was divided. Some hailed him as a pioneer, others branded him a necromancer, meddling with forces beyond human control. The church, already wary, preached sermons against his diabolical work. Yet, Aldini's experiment had another, unexpected legacy. It caught the eye of a young writer named Mary Shelley. He was invited to lecture across Europe, but whispers of madness followed him. His experiments grew less frequent, overshadowed by newer scientific fads. Yet the questions he raised lingered. Could science ever truly conquer death? And at what costs? To answer that, we need to look at the world Aldini left behind, a world that both feared and craved his vision. He wasn't just conducting an experiment. He was putting on a performance that would echo through history. Aldini's experiments, still fresh in the public's mind, shaped her vision of Victor Frankenstein, a scientist who uses electricity to animate a creature stitched from corpses. Insisted his goal was scientific: to understand the vital powers of electricity, not to play God. Yet he admitted the limitations. The bodies moved, but they didn't live. The brain, he suspected, was the key, but 19th century science lacked the tools to probe it. Still, Aldini believed he was laying the groundwork for future discoveries, perhaps even true resurrection. The parallels are uncanny. Both Aldini and Frankenstein sought to conquer death. Both wielded electricity as their tool, and both faced the horror of their creations. Shelley's novel, published in 1818, turned Aldini's science into a cautionary tale, warning of the dangers of unchecked ambition. It was here, in this grim theater of death, that Aldini would stage his most notorious experiment, one that would cement his legacy and spark a cultural phenomenon. The subject? George Foster, a 26-year-old murderer hanged for drowning his wife and child. His work with electricity paved the way for modern resuscitation techniques, like defibrillators, which use controlled shocks to restart hearts. In a way, every time a paramedic saves a life with a defibrillator, they're echoing Aldini's dream. But in 1803, that future was unimaginable. All the world saw was a corpse dancing under sparks, and a scientist who seemed to have crossed an invisible line. His body, still swinging from the gallows, was about to become the centerpiece of a scientific spectacle. Foster's execution was swift, but Aldini's preparations were anything but. Aldini's setup was a marvel of early electrical engineering. His voltaic pile, a stack of zinc and copper plates, hummed with power. One man reportedly fled, convinced Foster was about to rise and walk. Aldini, unfazed, pushed further, sending shocks through the torso. The body heaved, chest rising and falling in a grotesque parody of breathing. For nearly an hour, Aldini worked, each jolt drawing new convulsions. He later wrote that the muscle contractions so much increased as almost to give an appearance of reanimation. But Foster never spoke, never stood. The body remained a puppet, animated but lifeless. He attached rods to Foster's nerves, face, arms, even his rectum, believing it could stimulate the body's core. As he described in his 1803 book, the first shock sent Foster's jaw quivering, his face contorting into a grimace. The crowd gasped. Another shock, and his right hand clenched, fingers curling as if grasping for life. Then, the unthinkable. Foster's left eye snapped open, staring blankly into the void. To the audience, it was as if death itself had been defied. The theater erupted. Some screamed, others fainted. This wasn't resurrection, but it was close enough to terrify. Shelley was just 18 when she began Frankenstein in 1816. Inspired by conversations about galvanism with her husband, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron. But what did Aldini think of his own work? His writings show a man torn between confidence and doubt. Ironically, Aldini's experiments weren't entirely fruitless. As Aldini left London, his reputation soared and plummeted. The science and spectacle of the 19th century resurrection craze, Giovanni Aldini's London experiment in 1803 wasn't just a one-off horror show which was part of a broader, almost feverish obsession with resurrection that gripped the 19th century. The world was changing fast. Steam engines roared, cities swelled, and science promised to unravel mysteries once left to priests and poets. But nothing captured the public's imagination quite like the idea of cheating death. Aldini was at the forefront of this craze, but he wasn't alone. Bodies often from gallows or morgues were sliced open, wired up, and shocked in front of gasping crowds. Preachers thundered against scientists who stole the spark of life from the divine. Pamphlets warned that galvanism was a slippery slope to necromancy. Yet even religious critics couldn't resist the allure. Some attended Aldini's lectures, torn between fear and curiosity. This tension between faith and reason, horror and wonder defined the era. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was just the beginning. Gothic novels and stage plays filled with mad scientists and reanimated corpses became wildly popular. Aldini's experiments, once the stuff of lecture halls, were now the stuff of nightmares. To understand how his legacy lived on, we need to explore the world he left behind, world forever changed by his electric dreams. Aldini, with his flair for drama, thrived in it. He'd pause mid-experiment, letting a corpse's twitching hand hang in the air, drawing gasps before delivering a lecture on the vital powers of electricity. The smell of singed flesh, the creak of batteries, the unnatural jerk of a dead arm mitt was a sensory overload, yet the horror only fueled fascination. In an era of stark class divides, the wealthy watched as the powerless were cut open for science. His experiments, they said, weren't just theater, they were advancing medicine. By mapping how electricity affected muscles and nerves, he contributed to early neurology and cardiology. His work on animals even led to practical applications like using electric shocks to treat paralysis. But to the average onlooker, these benefits were abstract. What they saw was a man making corpses dance, and it left them wondering, where was the line between science and madness? This wasn't lost on the public. Riots broke out in some cities over body snatching, as grave robbers supplied anatomists with fresh corpses. Yet, he never shied away from the spotlight. His lectures grew grander, his batteries more powerful, as if daring the world to look away. By the mid-1800s, however, the galvanism craze was fading. New discoveries, germ theory, anesthesia stole the stage. Aldini's dream of reanimation began to feel like a relic, a footnote in a rapidly changing world. But his influence was far from over. Aldini, working legally, avoided much of this scandal, but his experiments still stirred unease. Was it ethical to make a spectacle of the dead, even in the name of progress? People saw these demonstrations as proof that science could challenge God's dominion. For some, it was thrilling. For others, it was blasphemy. Newspapers fanned the flames, printing lurid headlines about corpses brought to life and electric miracles. To understand his legacy, we need to dive into the wild, often gruesome world of resurrection science and why people couldn't look away. Galvanism, the science of using electricity to stimulate muscles, was the rock star of the era. Scientists across Europe were zapping everything from frogs to human limbs, hoping to crack the code of life. But these weren't quiet lab experiments, they were public spectacles. Anatomical theaters, once reserved for dissections, became stages for showmen like Aldini. Tickets were sold, crowds packed in, and the air buzzed with anticipation. It was part science, part circus, and the public ate it up. Why? Because death was no longer just a mystery, it was a puzzle science might solve. Aldini's peers were just as bold. In Germany, Karl August Weinhold claimed he de-reanimated a decapitated cat by replacing its spinal fluid with a metallic solution. In France, Xavier Bichat shocked headless corpses, noting how long they twitched before going still. These experiments weren't about raising the dead in Hollywood, since no one expected zombies, but about understanding what made life tick. Was it a soul, a chemical reaction, or, as Aldini believed, an electrical spark? Each twitching limb seemed to bring science closer to an answer. But let's be clear, these experiments were gruesome. The church, predictably, pushed back. But there was a darker side to this spectacle. The bodies Aldini and others used were often those of the poor executed criminals, vagrants, or unclaimed dead. Aldini's defenders argued that the ends justified the means. Aldini himself seemed aware of the controversy. In his writings, he emphasized the scientific value of his work, downplaying the theatrics. As galvanism waned, its cultural impact grew. Writers, artists, and playwrights seized on the image of the scientist defying death. The ethical quagmire in Aldini's decline. By the 1810s, Giovanni Aldini was a scientific celebrity, his name synonymous with the eerie power of galvanism, but fame came at a cost. His experiments, once hailed as revolutionary, were increasingly seen as macabre, even monstrous. The Enlightenment had unleashed a thirst for discovery, but it also sparked debates about the limits of human ambition. Aldini's experiments sat at the heart of this tension. On one hand, they promised medical breakthroughs. His work with electricity laid groundwork for understanding nerve function, and even inspired early attempts at electrotherapy. Today, medical ethics demand informed consent, but in Aldini's time, the concept barely existed. Historical records are sparse, but letters suggest he grew isolated, his once-packed lectures drawing smaller crowds. He shifted focus to practical applications of electricity, like fireproofing fabrics and improving lighthouses. His experiments with electrical stimulation influenced the development of defibrillators and pacemakers, tools that save millions today. But in his lifetime, he was a cautionary tale, a man whose ambition outpaced his era's moral compass. To fully grasp his impact, we need to look at how his ideas shaped not just science, but the stories we tell about it. These were safer, less controversial pursuits, but they lacked the drama that had defined him. He died in 1834, largely forgotten. His galvanism experiments overshadowed by new scientific giants like Michael Faraday. Yet Aldini's questions lingered. Could science ever master life and death? And should it? Friends described him as moody, consumed by a need to prove his work's value. The man who once lit up theaters with sparks now seemed haunted by them. Some historians speculate he wrestled with his own doubts. Had he gone too far? His writings hint at frustration, noting that the vital spark remained elusive, no matter how powerful his batteries. The bodies he used were those society-discarded criminals, the destitute, the forgotten. This raised a chilling question. Was science exploiting the vulnerable under the guise of progress? Philosophers like Immanuel Kant argued that human dignity extended beyond death, a view that clashed with Aldini's work. These debates, though abstract, seeped into public consciousness, casting a shadow over galvanism's allure. On the other, they turned human bodies into props, their dignity sacrificed for gasps and applause. This wasn't just a scientific issue, it was a profoundly human one. The world was starting to ask uncomfortable questions. How far could science go before it crossed a moral line? In the 1800s, dissection was a punishment reserved for the worst offenders, a final indignity after the gallows. By shocking these bodies into motion, Aldini was, in the eyes of some, desecrating the dead. Critics argued that even science didn't justify such acts. The families of the executed, often poor and powerless, had no say. Public outrage grew, fueled by stories of resurrection men stealing bodies for anatomists. Though Aldini worked with legal corpses, the association tainted his reputation. And what did it mean to manipulate the dead for knowledge? Or worse, for spectacle? In his 1803 book, he defended his methods, arguing that his goal was to ameliorate the condition of mankind. He claimed his experiments honored the dead by advancing knowledge that could save lives. But his words rang hollow to a public increasingly uneasy with the spectacle. Even his supporters began to distance themselves, wary of being linked to a man dubbed a ghoul by detractors. The tide was turning, and Aldini was caught in its undertow. To understand Aldini's decline, we need to step into the ethical quagmire his work created, and the personal toll it took on a man who dared to play with life's boundaries. The 19th century was a battleground for ethics and science. Aldini's use of executed criminals' bodies was particularly contentious. Aldini wasn't blind to these concerns. There was also the question of consent or lack thereof. Aldini's personal life began to unravel under the strain. By the 1820s, Aldini's career was in decline. In a twist of irony, Aldini's work found new life in medicine. The cultural echoes of Aldini's experiments. Giovanni. Aldini's experiments didn't just shock corpses, they shocked culture itself. By the 1820s, his galvanism demonstrations were fading from scientific circles, but their ripples were spreading through literature, theater, and the public imagination. The image of a scientist wielding electricity to defy death became a powerful symbol, one that both thrilled and terrified. To understand Aldini's true legacy, we need to explore how his work reshaped storytelling, sparked new fears, and planted the seeds for modern science fiction. His story didn't end in the lab, it lived on in the monsters we created. By the mid-19th century, galvanism had entered popular culture through galvanic quackery. Frankenstein is often called the first sci-fi novel, and its roots in galvanism set a template. Stories of scientists pushing boundaries, often with disastrous results. From H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau to modern films like Jurassic Park, the archetype of the mad scientist owes a debt to Aldini. His real-life audacity zapping corpses in front of gasping crowds gave writers a blueprint for characters who defy nature and pay the price. In a way, every sci-fi cautionary tale is a distant echo of his voltaic piles. Charlatans sold electric belts and shock machines, claiming they could cure everything from headaches to impotence. The idea that electricity could manipulate life sparked curiosity about the body's inner workings. By the late 19th century, scientists were building on his findings, using electricity to study nerves and muscles. This led to breakthroughs in physiology and medicine, from electrocardiograms to neural stimulation. Aldini's experiments, though controversial, helped demystify the body, paving the way for a more scientific understanding of life. His legacy was paradoxical, a source of both nightmares and progress. These scams, while far from Aldini's rigorous experiments, showed how deeply electricity had captured the public's imagination. People wanted to believe in its power, even if it meant falling for frauds. Aldini, who died in 1834, would likely have been horrified to see his science reduced to snake oil, but it proved his ideas had struck a chord. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818, was the most famous offspring of Aldini's experiments. Shelley, inspired by galvanism debates and Aldini's public demonstrations, crafted Victor Frankenstein as a fictional echo of the Italian scientist. Alchemy. Victor used electricity to animate the dead, but his creation, a patchwork creature, became a warning about unchecked ambition. These questions, born in his darkened theaters, continued to haunt society. They resurfaced in debates over cloning, AI, and genetic engineering, modern echoes of his electric dreams. To fully grasp Aldini's place in history, we need to look at how his work bridged the gap between the 19th century's wild experiments and today's cutting-edge science. The novel wasn't just a horror story, it was a meditation on science's limits. Shelley asked, "What happens when we play God?" Her answer, embodied in the monster's tragic loneliness, resonated deeply in a world grappling with rapid scientific change. Frankenstein was a cultural earthquake. It sold thousands of copies, spawned stage plays, and inspired countless imitations. Audiences flocked to theaters to see actors lurch across stages as reanimated corpses, their movements eerily reminiscent of Aldini's twitching bodies. These plays leaned hard into the Gothic with stormy castles and crackling sparks, but they also tapped into real anxieties. The Industrial Revolution was transforming, life factories churned, machines roared, and science seemed unstoppable. Aldini's experiments, once confined to lecture halls, became a metaphor for a world racing toward an uncertain future.
I see.
Beyond Frankenstein, Aldini's influence seeped into the broader Gothic movement. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne penned tales of scientists tampering with life, their stories dripping with the same mix of awe and dread that Aldini's work evoked. In Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, the line between life and death blurs in unsettling ways, echoing Galvanism's unsettling promise. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were a way for society to process the ethical questions Aldini raised. Could science go too far? And what did it mean to be human in an age of machines? Theater wasn't the only stage for Aldini's legacy. Aldini's experiments also laid the groundwork for science fiction as a genre. But Aldini's cultural impact wasn't just about fear. His work also inspired wonder. As the century turned, Aldini's name faded, but his questions didn't. Could science master life and death, and at what cost? Aldini's legacy in modern science and beyond Giovanni Aldini's experiments ended nearly 2 centuries ago. But their impact pulses through our world today. From life-saving medical devices to the ethical debates shaping science, Earthwork with galvanism left a mark that's both profound and surprising. Aldini's experiments with electrical stimulation were crude, but they were a crucial step toward understanding the body's electrical nature. By showing that electricity could trigger muscle movement, he helped lay the foundation for electrophysiology, the study of the body's electrical signals. In the 20th century, this field gave us tools like the electrocardiogram, which maps heart activity, and the defibrillator, which uses controlled shocks to restart a stopped heart. The public outcry over body snatching and galvanism led to laws like the 1832 Anatomy Act in Britain, which regulated corpse use and curbed grave robbing. These were early steps toward modern medical ethics, which prioritized patient rights and informed consent. These characters, with their wild hair and sparking machines, are caricatures of Aldini's real-life audacity. He was a man of his time, driven by the Enlightenment's hunger for knowledge, yet ahead of his time asking questions we're still answering. In the flickering light of his voltaic piles, we see the 19th century's wild dreams and deep fears, a time when science dared to challenge the divine. Aldini wasn't just a scientist. He was a pioneer who pushed humanity to ask big questions. What is life? Can we master it? And should we? His experiments, equal parts genius and grotesque, left us with tools to save lives and stories to haunt our dreams. Was he a mad scientist? Maybe, but he was also a visionary who saw electricity's potential to transform lives. Every breakthrough, from AI to gene editing, carries echoes of his ambition in his warnings. And ring the bell for more stories that uncover the strange and true. What's the wildest scientific experiment you've heard of? Drop it in the comments, we might cover it next. Until then, keep exploring the past, because history is anything but dead. So, the next time you hear a defibrillator hum or read a sci-fi thriller, think of Aldini, the man who made the dead dance and the world wonder. His story is a reminder that science is never just about facts. It's about courage, hubris, and the eternal quest to understand what makes us alive. They remind us that science at its boldest can inspire both awe and fear. His experiments, though long past, continue to fuel our obsession with pushing boundaries. Whether it's colonizing Mars or uploading consciousness to the cloud, Aldini's excesses, though unsettling, push society to set boundaries, ensuring science serves humanity without exploiting it. His story is a case study in why ethics must evolve alongside discovery. Every time a paramedic yells clear, saves a life, they're building on Aldini's work. His experiments inspired not just Frankenstein, but a whole genre of stories about resurrection and artificial life. Today's sci-fi, from Westworld to Black Mirror, grapples with the same questions Aldini raised. What makes us human? Can technology recreate life? These stories, like his experiments, blur the line between wonder and warning, challenging us to think critically about our future. In a way, Aldini's greatest creation was in T, a reanimated corpse. Was a narrative that still shapes how we see science. He wasn't just a showman making corpses twitch. He was a pioneer whose ideas helped redefine how we understand life, death, and the human body. Aldini's experiments inspired early research into electrical therapies. In the 1890s, Scientists used his findings to develop electroconvulsive therapy for mental illness, though its use was controversial. In the 19th century, his use of corpses raised questions about dignity and consent. Today, those questions echo in controversies over genetic editing, AI, and organ harvesting. For example, CRISPR technology lets us edit DNA, potentially curing diseases, but also raising fears of designer babies. Aldini's story reminds us that every leap forward comes with a moral cost when we still learning to weigh. Later, his work influenced neuromodulation techniques like deep brain stimulation, which uses tiny electrical pulses to treat Parkinson's disease and depression. These advances show Aldini's vision wasn't entirely mad. He saw electricity as a key to life, and modern medicine proved him right, even if he never lived to see it. In this final section, we'll trace Aldini's legacy from the 19th century to the present, exploring how his electric sparks ignited revolutions in medicine, ethics, and even our imagination. Let's start with the most tangible legacy: medicine. This connection isn't just poetic, it's direct. But Aldini's legacy isn't all triumph. His experiments also forced society to confront the ethics of scientific ambition, a debate that's more relevant than ever. His work also shaped how we regulate science. Beyond science, Aldini's legacy lives in our cultural fascination with defying death. Even in pop culture, Aldini's shadow lingers. The mad scientist trope, think Dr. Frankenstein or Doc Brown from Back to the Future, was much to his dramatic demonstrations. So, where does Aldini stand today? He's not a household name like Edison or Einstein, but his influence is undeniable. Giovanni Aldini's story is more than a tale of sparks and corpses. It's a window into a world wrestling with the boundaries of life and death. Today, we live in Aldini's future, where electricity restarts, hearts and ethics guide our discoveries. But his legacy reminds us to tread carefully. Thanks for joining us on Real History. You were gripped by this electric tale, hit that like button, subscribe,